this computer. And if you want to go ahead and start talking, actually, I'll introduce you. Hi, everyone. My name is Rochelle, and I work here at the Vermillion Public Library in Vermillion, South Dakota. And today we have Eliza Blue tuning in from, I believe, Bison, South Dakota. Is that where it is? So here I'll hand it over to Eliza.
Hello, everyone. So we, as in my family ranch is up in Bison, so the most northwestern part of the state. And I did not grow up here, and I still often am surprised that I found myself here, and it's been 10 years now. But I originally came out to teach school, but it was meant to be a temporary adventure. So I thought I was going to be here just for a few years and then figure out what was going to happen next, because the first part of my adulthood I spent as a touring musician, and I'd sort of reached a point in my career where I didn't want to be on the road anymore. I wanted more stability, but I really wasn't sure what that was going to look like. And then I had the fateful encounter that changed my life forever was a neighbor or someone living on a neighboring ranch that I became friends with let me take some bum lambs home to bottle feed in my garage and raise. And I was going to, bring them back. I just thought it would be a fun experience. And instead I fell in love with them. And then after that, I could never leave again because I had to, they were then my family members that would need to come with me. And similarly, I had adopted some chicks from the third grade classes, spring unit on baby chickens. And so lucky for me, I met my husband and we fell in love, and the rest is history. But it's been an interesting ride, to say the least, because I kind of had to hit the ground running in terms of figuring out what this ranching thing is all about, and trying to find my place here in the midst of being an agricultural worker who has no experience. And the gift of that has been, I think I ask a lot of questions, I guess. So things that maybe are obvious to everyone else are not obvious to me. And that's been great as a writer, I think. But it's also been really interesting as a person, again, working in agriculture in this particular time, I think, where there are a lot of people asking big questions and looking towards the future as this industry shifts. So that's partly what my talk is about. So now most of you guys, I'm like going to click through my screen really quick. It looks like most of you guys I can't see you, and which is fine. But I was wondering how many of you have grown up on ranches or farms. That would be, if you would feel comfortable sharing that, you can just put it in the chat. I'm gonna click on it right now. Because like I said, I know on Zoom it can be hard to do things in an interactive way, but I would love to hear people's perspectives as we go through the talk, and especially for those of you that may have the experience that I didn't, which is actually having grown up on a farm or a ranch. So if you feel comfortable putting that in the chat, great. Otherwise, I will launch right in. So the funny thing, grew up as a city girl and have lived in Vermillion for over 50 years. Then we have that in common, because I definitely started out a city girl. Before I moved here, I lived in the most recent place before moving to South Dakota that I lived was Minneapolis. But before that, I lived in New York City. So it's been quite a change. So part of what this talk is about is reimagining the homesteader narrative. And part of the reason that I have such an interest in that is that before coming here, part of, I think, what drew me here in the first place is that I loved the Little House on the Prairie books growing up. I read them, over and over and over again, and was really enamored with that story and with that lifestyle. And so my mom always jokes that when I first came out to South Dakota, she knew I was never going to leave, because she's like, you've been wanting to be a prairie girl your whole life. um, so for me personally, it's been interesting then to confront the realities after having read the books. And granted, the Little House books, the ones that do take place in South Dakota, obviously is East River. West River is very different, sort of geologically, and from an agriculture perspective, we do things very different out here, because we just it's a different, a lot less rainfall and things like that. So our ag practices are different than what you'd find East River. But regardless, in going back now and rereading these again as an adult, and also as a person who actually is living and working on the prairie, something here, I'm going to read just a little tiny section. So this is from the little town on the prairie, which is When They're in DeSmet. And this is after, for those of you who haven't read it or don't remember, this is the book where they've sort of settled into their homestead, and they just keep having failure after failure with new things going wrong. So first, I think it's the gophers eat all their corn, and then the blackbirds come and eat all their, or maybe it's maybe they eat the oats. And anyway, they just keep losing everything, like every season. So that afternoon, so this is Laura, and she says, that afternoon, looking up from her sewing to thread her needle, she saw a wisp of smoke wavering in the heat of the prairie. Pa had taken time from his work in the oat field to cut a swath around the patch of Spanish grass and set fire to those vicious grasses, because now they've also found this invasive weed that's like can kill your sheep and things like that. So she says to Ma, the prairie looks so beautiful and gentle, she said, but I wonder what it will do next. It seems like we have to fight it all the time. This earthly life is a battle, said Ma, and if it isn't one thing to contend with, it's another. It always has been so, and it always will be so. The sooner you make up your mind to it, the better off you are, and the more thankful for your pleasures. So I thought that was really, it really struck me as that being kind of the philosophy of these books. And when you look over the whole trajectory of the series, it's pretty, Laura Ingalls Wilder writes so glowingly of the prairie landscapes and so lovingly, and she really captures the beauty, the natural beauty of this place. But yeah, that all throughout all the books, they are in what I would describe as a battle against nature and the elements to try to carve out a living. And there's a surprising lot of failure. So they make the best of it, but it's very, very difficult. And they accept that that's how it's supposed to be. It's supposed to feel like a struggle, which again, I think is really noteworthy. So I'm going to talk more about that later, but I wanted to just put this in juxtaposition. So this is a book by Linda Hazelstrom, who lives down in Hermosa and is just if you don't know her, she's a fantastic Dakota writer, and I highly recommend. But she is still living and working, and in fact has a great writer's workshop. If anybody is a writer on this call, she it's called the Windbreak House, and it's part of where I got to work with her a little bit when I was first writing my book. So yeah, I highly recommend working with her if you are looking for a writing teacher. So this is from her book Gathering from the Grasslands, and it's written kind of as a journal. And so this is an entry that's dated March 31st. A heron stands in the pond, looking like a Chinese painting through the fog. I love seeing them fly because they carry their necks in an S shape and trail their long legs. We often see two great blues standing on the opposite side of Lake Linda hour after hour, patiently waiting for the perfect strike. When the great beak descends and then flashes backward, we know the bird is swallowing prey, usually a frog or a small turtle, though it also may eat snakes, insects, and smaller birds. Even in the darkness, the small prey is not safe from the mighty bill. I started reading about and I don't know how to pronounce this, Vipassana meditation, about gurus and yoga, but I stopped when I realized that the prairie is both my path to enlightenment and enlightenment itself. The prairie is suitably immense in age and serenity. Its silence and depth provide a meditation room for anyone who pays attention. Sit in silence and open yourself, say the gurus, and you will see God or goddess in whatever manifestation most appeals to you. Around me, I see nothing that is not holy. Goddess in the grass, the birds, the clouds, antelope, muddy pond, goddess in the sunlight. So obviously, that's a pretty different take. And then one more I'm going to read you. This is actually from the South Dakota Magazine, January, February 2020, which I don't know if your library has backdated issues of the South Dakota Magazine, but this has Seasons of the Moon was a special, or was an article that they have in this month where they've got Virginia Driving Hawk Sneeve, who is a great writer, and she's written some a children's book that we really love that the South Dakota Humanities Council put out a few years ago, that now I'm blanking on the name, but it's a really neat book. This, however, she put together, it's the Seasons of the Moon, with accompanying pictures by Christian Begeman. They're really beautiful. And so it's little haikus that go with every month of the year. And these are related to, so her grandfather, Robert Driving Hawk, translated the Lakota names of the 12 months into English. And then she wrote them in what she says, I now write them in the tradition of another culture, Japanese haiku. But what I wanted to share with you is the preface that she has for this. She says, in the time when the Lakota followed the buffalo over the plains, there were no clocks in the lodges. People rose with the sun, ate when hungry, slept when the sun set. There was no need to set a time for hunting, fishing, tanning hides, or courting. These things happened when there was a need. There was no calendar to note the year or month. A child did not say, I am 10 years old. She counted her age by the number of winters she had lived. Winters were hard times for people on the plains. They were often hungry because hunting was difficult in cold and deep snow. Only the hardiest survived the winters. The weakest, the old and the young died in the winter. Elders were highly respected because they endured the hardships of life, but they also gained wisdom in surviving many years. They kept track of passing time by the phases of the moon, when certain natural events always occurred, and so they named them the lunar phases. So again, part of what I thought was interesting about that, it's a different way to conceive of the plains and how to negotiate living on the plains, but it's not entirely dissimilar from what Laura's mother describes, in that this life was not easy and that there was struggle involved, but there's pretty big differences in the way that was negotiated, and how to deal with the struggles that are inherent in living in a place where the landscape it's not great for human life, basically. Not conducive to humans thriving, as opposed to, someplace in the tropics, let's say. And now I've just lost my pen. But so, these were all questions that I sort of brought to the table as I was writing my own book and in the work that I'm continuing to do now. And it's funny, actually, so this talk, when I first proposed it to the Humanities Council, it's evolved even since then. So that was last fall, as my own thinking on this topic has, the more I read and the more I think about it, the more my thoughts on it evolve as well. But what I was really interested in the beginning and continue to question is sort of how can we find a way to work within this ecosystem, again, as a person working in agriculture, and for all the rest of us who, whether if you aren't working actually on the ground like me, how you're still buying products that are produced, because we all are buying food, and food comes from the land for the most part. At least the beginning part of it does. It maybe goes through some other cycles before it gets to your table, but that's where it's all generated from. So when we think about where our food comes from and the work of people who are working in agriculture, how do we work within an ecosystem? So part of the research I started doing was to look at, the people that lived here for millennia, how were they surviving, as opposed to, no offense to Laura Ingalls Wilder, because I do love her, people who were not thriving, who were struggling. What were the differences, and what can we learn from that? And what I found was actually sort of depressing in that this area that I live in, and granted it's different East River, but where I live, where there's less than 13 inches of rainfall on average a year, and where there is, high winds 12 months a year, there's cold weather at 9 months a year, and very, very hot weather for the other 3 months. The people that lived on this land, so it was Arikara, there was Hidatsa, eventually Lakota came here, but that was actually much more recent. But the Hidatsa were here for thousands of years, and they'd built cities, but they were along the banks of the Missouri River. And they only came out to where we live when they were hunting. So during good weather, they wouldn't have tried to spend a winter here, because that would be crazy. and I found that out during a winter, of course, and I was like, oh, okay, this explains a lot. Because it does feel very inhospitable to any kind of animal that doesn't have extremely thick hide and some type of fur to try to weather the plains all winter long, or the northern plains. So that being said, here we are. And here we are, as in literally me, myself, and my family, trying to figure out how to do this. Now, there's a movement in agriculture right now called Regenerative Agriculture, which is designed to more closely mimic the natural cycle of life on the plains. And it's much more about engaging with trying to keep the native plants, which even that term is a little problematic because everything is always evolving, including the plant, the flora and fauna of the plains. So it's not a static thing, and it never has been. But how do we help, or how do we not create imbalances that nature then has to compensate for in ways that don't help the many different plants and animals here thrive? And one way to do that is with intensive grazing. So that's something that we've been looking at, and rotational grazing in general has now become pretty much the common practice in this area. Just recognizing that you need to move your animals, and you need to move them frequently, which mimics the way that ruminants would have lived here, for thousands and thousands of years. And that as they move, they are fertilizing the ground and the plants. And all the other, so the large ruminants are in fact, they're really helpful for regenerating the landscape in a place where there isn't a lot of rainfall, because we don't get, compared to you East River, we don't get as much stuff dying and falling down in the ground and then fertilizing the ground. So we need the animals to come and basically poop on the grass. That's the fertilizer. And even, peeing is watering the grass too. So that as weird as that sounds, that's actually helpful for this ecosystem. And without it, it is hard for the grasses to thrive in the way they should, or would be able to, I guess I should say. So that being said, we've got the other writer that I wanted to talk to you about was Dan O'Brien, which, again, I would ask for a show of hands if anybody knows work already. So if you have any thoughts on him and you want to add it to the chat, go ahead. But he is also, like Linda, is a rancher, and he lives down in oh my gosh, now I can't. Well, he's right outside of Rapid City. And his ranch is Wild Idea Buffalo Ranch, which is another place, if you haven't heard of, I would encourage you to look it up, because they are doing some really neat things. And I think he's mostly retired now from running the ranch, but I think it's maybe his daughter and her husband are kind of running it now. And it's huge. So they have a lot of different partners, but they were really on the forefront of the concept of rotational grazing. And they even took it a step further and decided to do it with buffalo instead of cattle. And had a lot of success with regenerating the landscape that had been degraded by the type of grazing that now isn't common practice, but was when he first started his ranch, which is to say just kind of leaving animals in a pasture and then that being that. So things would get grazed down, and it wasn't as healthy when he first moved there and started with buffalo. So his book, Buffalo for the Broken Heart, is just, I love Dan O'Brien's book. Yes. And we order meat from Wild Idea. Yay. That's great. So yeah, Buffalo for the Broken Heart is the book where he really discusses that transition from ranching in a more traditional way to doing something different. And for him also, it is not seamless. In fact, one of his who used to be on the English faculty. Oh, that's so cool. Yeah, he also was a professor, but I don't think in South Dakota. I think he was maybe somewhere in Colorado or something. But I know he taught English at the college level at some point, because he talks about it as like, in order to fund his ranching habit, he had to go other places and teach. So again, it was a struggle at the beginning, but once they made this transition and got some of the infrastructure in place, they actually found that it was easier to do that work than it had been. So again, for me, being in the middle of my own story related to these ideas, it's part of what I feel like I, on an individual level, am trying to conquer is this, I think some people would call it a colonizing mindset, and I don't disagree with that assessment, where we come to a place and we are attempting to wrangle it and control it, instead of recognizing that, that we need to work with it and let it work with us, and that the work at this point for most of us who are out here trying to figure out how to actually make a go of it is trying to change our own mindsets of how to do that. And it is not seamless, and it is not without struggle. And as Virginia says in her prologue to her poems, this has always been hard. It is not necessarily obvious how to move forward. But that being said, we have to keep trying. And all right, which brings me to my own book here, which I was joking is always the one that I forget to add to the pile. So this is a book, it's called Accidental Rancher. It is, I wrote this in the sort of early days of being on the ranch, and also my kids are 4.5 almost 4.5 and almost 6. And so this was kind of the early days of parenthood and the early days of ranching, which meant that there was a lot of, chaos, to say the least. But and for the most part, this book is more about sort of those personal things, and is, I guess, in some ways a little more lighthearted, rather than diving into the sort of science of soil health, for example. But this is a chapter from the book. It's called Drought. And this, I'll say more about it in a minute, but so this was written in 2017 when we were suffering through drought, and it was my first experience. And now here we are, 2021, and it is once again, we're entering into the summer, having gotten almost no rain in this year. I think we've had like 3/100ths or something. That's how little we get, and that's how we measure it, because it's like a big deal to have anything at all. So I'll say more about that in a minute, but this chapter is called Drought. It's dry, very, very dry. A year ago last spring, a drought looming large, my husband was glued to the Weather Channel's radar app, watching the colored clouds of rain pass us by. This year, he rarely bothered. There were no storms anywhere, but sun and endless wind. In May, when we still had hope of moisture, we planted an auntie apple tree, a gift for our infant daughter from her aunt, and a sister tree to the one we planted just before my son was born. The man of the ranch dug into the earth, and the metal shovel clanked like he was striking stone. Every few minutes, he had to stop and refill the hole with water to soften the soil before he could scrape out any dirt at all. We watered the tree all summer, letting the hose run and run. Even so, the tree lost most of its leaves by July. The remaining leaves were tinged a brittle brown, and the tree's slim branches leaned east, too exhausted to stand upright. Of course, that wasn't the worst of it. Cow-calf pairs began showing up at the sale barn midsummer because folks didn't have enough grass. As the days clicked by, the time for haying came and went, and still there was no rain. Before the end of July, our grass was grazed to gray stubble, so the man of the ranch put the cows in the winter pasture and opened the gate for our small flock of sheep. They would be free-ranging for the rest of the summer, finding what they could in the windbreaks and yard. Since then, we said goodbye to every animal we could part with, and thanked our lucky stars we didn't have to say goodbye to them all. For a girl from the suburbs, it's been an education. And agricultural work means your livelihood rests on the spine of a fickle beast, sometimes friend and sometimes foe. Like the prairie grasses, those born and raised to the work here have set down deep, dense roots, the cycles of boom and bust scrawled on their DNA. For my part, I would never have guessed I would spend so much time praying for rain, or so much time lamenting the lack of it. All of this is a preface for why, when the county conservation office in town held its annual tree sale, one tree for $1, I probably shouldn't have spent $20. It was a classic mistake made by a person raised with a sprinkler-greened lawn, but I should have known better. After all, I'd watched my husband plant the anti-tree. I'd mostly picked sensible trees, Russian olive, buffalo berry, and 3 beautiful resilient Amur maples. But I'd also gotten 2 willows and 2 dogwoods, trees that I missed from back east. For $1 each, I figured we could plant them by the dam, and if they died, they died. It was no great loss. Of course, that was a terrible idea, even in a year when water was plentiful. If they aren't behind fences, the cattle gnaw small trees down to nubs and then trample whatever is left. But because my husband loves me and forgives me for being equal parts hopeful and foolish, we planted them anyway. It was over 90 degrees in the shade on the day we went down to the dam. I stood holding my son's hand, my daughter strapped to my back, watching the man of the ranch dig a hole in the dark dirt. "Come look at this," he said when he finished. Beside the hole, on the other side of a stand of scrubby buffalo berry bushes, was the biggest rose bush I'd ever seen, and every snaking branch was covered with hundreds of tiny pink buds. As we marveled, we realized that there were rose bushes everywhere, curling around the base of an ash tree, curving beneath a hedge of snowberry brush, all of them ready to burst into flower like birds into song. How had we never noticed these before? Well, usually the grasses are high in June, obscuring the soft music of those blossoms with their tall green shadows. So while the clouds passing overhead may not contain rain, they do contain a silver lining. Henry Vaughan writes in his poem Revival, "And here in the dust and dirt, oh here, the lilies of his love appear." It was too dry for lilies this year, but we still had roses, their roots reaching deep into the earth, and yes, so much love. So that chapter I was pretty proud of when I wrote. I thought that was a nice idea that, like, wow, even though there are so many things that are difficult about drought, here we've found a silver lining in these beautiful roses that otherwise we wouldn't have been able to see because of the tall grass. And I was pretty satisfied, you know, with my writerly imagination was pretty satisfied with that conclusion. But in the interim, I've you know, thought more about it and realized that how funny it is, again, to recognize that instead of saying like, oh, it's so sad about the grass, and but yay for the roses, that seeing that things are thriving even in drought. That's what I missed. I'm pointing out here, I'm a person who's used to sprinkler green lawns, and yet I'm still approaching it with that same mindset, which is feeling like I need to put a silver lining on it, much like Ma in Little House on the Prairie, who is saying, you know, we just have to accept that earthly life is a struggle, and that's just the way it is. And then we just need to appreciate our blessings, which is not bad advice. However, what a different mindset it is to instead think, well, gosh, the roses are doing fine, even though it's so dry. Like, what does that mean? And what can we do with that information? So this year, as I said, we're going into a drought again. And it's maybe going to rain tomorrow, so this could all change. We don't know, which is another interesting part about this lifestyle, is that it can turn on a dime, and there's no way to tell. So you have to be just waiting a lot of the time to see what will happen next. And sorry, I'm just reading this. Looks like the cover was modeled after Harvey Dunn's "The Prairie is My Garden." It is modeled after that. This we actually also did for South Dakota Magazine. This is a tangent, sorry, but there's a place out by Isabel, South Dakota, and they had asked a photographer to go out because the people that live on this land, was not in their family when this occurred, but several generations ago, the family that lived there, they had let Harvey Dunn stay for a summer, and he had done lots of sketches. So they said that this exact little piece of land was where the original sketches took place, and the mother of that family was the original model and her two kids. So they had asked me to go, because I live pretty close to Isabel, me to go and be the stand-in, and then my kids, who are obviously smaller than the children in that picture, but just to demonstrate how this may have been the original location. And anyway, that it was so popular that they ended up, South Dakota Magazine is who published this book, and they wanted to use it as a cover because they'd gotten such a great response from it. So that's the story of the cover. But back to this year as we go into drought and trying to decide what to do. Now, sometimes I get into a pessimistic state of mind and think that things are only getting worse over time. That progress is an illusion. That is part of our problem, is that we think things are getting better because they're becoming more mechanized and industrialized. And in fact, I think, as the past few years have demonstrated, that that's just not always the case. However, I do feel like there are things to celebrate. And again, when we think about what Virginia was writing about in the preface to the haikus, is that there was a time when you just expected that only the strong would survive. That was expected. And that's no longer the case. And that's even true if we look back to the natural cycle of life on the plains. Drought was part of it. And what would happen is a lot of animals would just die. And that's how it was handled. And now we just we sell them and they go somewhere else where it isn't drought stricken. And so I think that actually is progress. I mean, if I was a cow, I think I'd probably rather just go to Kansas than starve to death. So I'm hopeful about that. And similarly, we've been looking at, when I talk again about planting trees in this book, I've learned a lot more since then about why we don't need trees on the plains, and why the trees, that is kind of, that mindset is left over from those of us whose ancestors came from someplace else where trees were plentiful and were part of the ecosystem. And that was how we understood how to, that we need trees to build our houses. We need trees for shade. Like that, we know how to practice agriculture in a place where there are trees. We don't know how to do it here. So we are going to try to make it look like what is familiar. And that's a real problem, because trees aren't meant to grow here. So that being said, trees are fantastic, and they do provide shade, which is wonderful when the heat is killing us. So, because it does get pretty brutal here, and the animals don't particularly love it either. So what we are working on right now is figuring out ways that we can use the gray water from our house to water trees around our house. And then, not necessarily worrying about planting tree breaks outside of the place right around our house and around the corrals where we might bring animals in for storms and things like that. So to me, again, this is how we can look at how can we regenerate this ecosystem, and how can we be respectful of this ecosystem, but also how can we find ways to be resilient within the ecosystem that maybe that probably isn't meant to sustain human life and some of the animals that we're raising. This is not the climate that is best for them. And yet, I mean, we do need to produce food. Like, food has to happen. People need food. And that, again, if we keep working and looking back at indigenous wisdom, looking back at traditional practices that were able to work for thousands of years without damaging the ecosystem, if we can learn from that, but then bring, what we, as modern human beings, we all kind of have the expectation now that we're going to have heat in our homes in the winter, and that we're going to have fresh water at our disposal. So if those are our expectations and that's how we want to live, then we need to figure out ways that we can do that are sustainable. So again, for us, looking at ways to use gray water is a big part of that. And similarly, we've been talking about solar power and wind power as being a potential to move forward. That's not, it's not ancient practice, but hopefully those can be ways that we can thrive as human beings, and not have to let the weakest among us die when it gets cold, and still be in a relationship that's relatively symbiotic, so we're not destroying landscapes in the way that, honestly, we are right now. So those are all the questions I ask myself. Again, those are the things I think about. Now, I wanted to open it up. We've still got plenty of time, but I did want to open it up for any questions, any specific questions. I have one more thing that I was going to read too, but before I go any further along, I just want to see so again, if you feel comfortable, you can just you can unmute yourself and just ask a question, but if you'd rather do it in the chat, that's perfectly fine too. And I guess I shouldn't even say just questions. If you have thoughts you'd like to share, I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts too. It's funny that there's somebody, Allie King. I just clicked through and I thought that was really you. And I was like, boy, she's in the same position she was earlier. And then I realized it's a photograph. She has not moved at all. All right, so let's see if I can find this. Now I'm going to read, let's see if I can find it. This one is actually on my computer screen because this is not, I have not published or printed this yet. It's just something I'm working on. So I wanted to read a little bit. So I'm gonna take it to a slightly darker place, and I apologize in advance because I don't see anyone with questions, so I'm just gonna dive right in. So again, for me as a person who has very young children and thinking about what they are inheriting, that is something I worry about a lot. So this is something I've been working on related to when this area was first opened up for homesteading. And like at, the county that I actually live in. So like I said, before it was opened up for homesteading, which happened relatively late, it wasn't opened up until 1908. And before that, it had been a reservation. But before that, it's actually pretty hard to find. I've had a hard time finding the history of this specific region just because it's never been a sort of a place of interest, because unlike the Black Hills, they didn't find gold. It's not great for planting crops. And so I think there was also a time where it was just, essentially we're more like the Wild West River, in that it was kind of free and open, and people would run cattle, and there were even like I said, the Arikara and Hidatsa, and then eventually the Lakota, and I think there's one other that I'm forgetting, the Crow, and anyway, they often, there was a lot of skirmishes going on, just as far as I can find anyway, where it was kind of unclear who had dominion because it was always changing, and like everyone was kind of using it for hunting. So it was, you know, maybe seasonal as well. I'm not really sure. But regardless, when it finally, when they opened it up for homesteading, and this was pretty similar to, if anyone's read the memoir, The Land of the Burnt Thigh, it's a similar time period to that, and a similar phenomena, which is the United States government had already sort of identified that the land West River was not going to be good for agriculture in the way that the land East River was, and that the amount of acreage you would need to survive, they knew there wasn't water here. And they knew that the amount of acreage you would need to survive was much higher than what they were allotting to people. And basically, I mean, there were people within the government, you know, that had come out here and surveyed and said, yeah, this people aren't going to be able to survive on what you're saying that you'll give them. But the railroad barons, they wanted to build railroads, and they wanted to have towns, and they wanted to be shipping shipping goods out on the railroads to people. So they actually thought it was fine if people couldn't survive on the land, because they just wanted to build towns, basically. And so they pushed through and that's why they didn't want to give people bigger acreage, because then there'd be less people who would be, you know, needing to rely on the railroads for all the things that they would need. So again, there was a recognition, and I mean, talk about short-sighted. I don't know how they thought that was going to work out long-term, but I guess they didn't care, because they were interested in short-term profits. So they opened it up in 1908. And so here, I'm just going to read you a little bit. So our county wasn't open for homesteading until 1908, during the second wave of immigration to the Dakotas. In 1909, the area was flooded with hopeful greenhorns. They had harnessed their futures to land west of 20, where the average annual precipitation amounts to less than 20 inches, or near desert conditions. The experience of those first pioneers mirrored my own, because the first year that homesteaders found themselves here, they were living in a verdant paradise. Rain was abundant, and consequently so were crops. At that time, it was believed that rain would follow the plow, and for that first year, it appeared to be true. The year 1910 revealed this misconception to be fantasy. Whereas 1909 had been unusually wet, many homesteaders lost their investments of time and money when, during the second year, that the region failed to receive even if its average of 14 inches. They learned, as I have, that average doesn't mean much in these parts. The drought continued for another year, and having already mortgaged their land for what it was worth, the families had no choice but to abandon their homesteads. From a population of 11,348 in the 1910 federal census, our county was listed as 7,640 people in the state census conducted just 5 years later. Now that number stands at 2,982. So that's a pretty big difference, from 11,000 to 2,000. If climate scientists' predictions are correct, and current global trends indicate that it's already begun, climate change will create or intensify exactly this kind of boom and bust cycle with weather around the globe, by creating longer periods of drought and more extreme weather events as well. Like those early homesteaders, more and more people will be forced to abandon homes and livelihoods, but instead of heading back east, as many of those turn of the last century climate refugees did, it's unclear where a safer place to head will be. According to those same predictions, where I live, like the rest of the Great Plains, will continue to be ravaged by drought, the green years in between the arid ones growing fewer and fewer until the plains become essentially desert. So, why am I writing all this? Because in the midst of our drought, I have finally started to see the shape resilience must take. Here, time is carved around the weather. Every stretch of good weather is bookended by stretches of bad. It's dry, too dry. I hold my breath. It is raining. I exhale. I'm going to have to learn to breathe through both if I hope to be any help at all. Temperate grasslands, savannas, and shrubland are the least protected and most converted biome on the planet. That's one of the reasons that the World Wildlife Fund decided to start a program on the Northern Plains. It's one of the 4 large, intact temperate grassland ecosystems on the planet. According to Marissa Erling, a prairie ecologist with the Nature Conservancy, if North and South Dakota were grassland, where grasslands have seen losses to cropland, similar to conversion rates in the Amazon forest, if we could preserve only 10% of the remaining unprotected prairie, we could avoid 11.7 million tons of CO2 emissions over 20 years. This, she notes, is the same as taking 2.5 million passenger cars off the road for a year. So, I'll skip to the conclusion here. So after all this, we had a day of rain. So then I write this conclusion. Back at the house, I rejoice in the mud the dog tracks in and the pile of jeans in the laundry room. This rain, after years without, is a benediction. In the pasture, the sheep and cows graze, droplets streaming off their back. Next week, things will be different, so I accept the blessings as they are bestowed, one cloud at a time. In the meantime, I will do the best I am able to preserve, to protect, and to grow the change that is required for our survival. So, again, kind of going back to all these different topics and how can we grow that change and what can we do? And like I said, it's a work in progress, and it's not easy and it's not obvious, but I think for me personally, regenerative agriculture offers a lot of keys for moving forward. And I think even when it comes to croplands, there's some really, I wouldn't call them innovations because they've been around for a while, but they're starting to take hold in a new way. So again, if this is a topic that interests you, I would advise looking into Gabe Brown's writings if you don't already know him. And he's actually a North Dakota rancher and farmer, and he wrote a book called Dirt to Soil that is not as literary as some of the other things I've written. It's much more, he does what I don't, which is he knows more about the science of it, and it's much more a practical guide to this is how you convert a ranch to be regenerative, and it follows his journey to doing that. And similarly, they still grow crops, but they've been able, by planting cover crops and just making different choices in the way that they let their livestock graze the cover crops to fertilize the land. So they're able to still grow food as well as, having livestock, and still be increasing their soil health and still increasing the carbon that's able to be stored in the soil. So I find that really inspiring and hopeful. And I'm going to leave you with one more thing, unless there are any other questions or thoughts. It's a lot of information. This is a poem from Linda that I just really love. So this will be my last little offering to you. Because again, this kind of, what I appreciate about her work in general, and then again, her work as a rancher, is figuring out how we can be members of this community. And for me, what I mean by say that is like not just members of the human community, but members of the community of plants and the microbes in the soil and the animals that dwell here. How can we all live together and all be thriving? That's what we need to figure out. And I'm thinking about it just, this is where I live and this is where I work, but I think that's the question any of us can ask wherever it is that we've landed. How can I be a member of this ecosystem, and so that I may thrive, but also everything else that lives in this ecosystem can thrive too. So anyway, I just love this as a way to think about this, not just from the sciencey perspective, but from the poetry and the soul. I guess I'd call it the soul perspective. So it's called Rankin Ridge, and then the subtitle is Only an Ancient Moon. The sun drops below the high tree. Elk cows, the color of grass, move out of the pines, up the meadows toward a pond. Dark among the trees, the bulls pace, snort, begin to bugle. That sound flows across meadows like water, opening like a piccolo, rising to a keen cry, a wail, an ululation for light. The moon lifts, huge, gold, flattened, pushing to higher air, becoming small, silver, distant. The cows graze silent in the glowing grass. The bulls wait at the edge of the trees, bugling. The moonlight flickers at sounds too high for human ears. So thank you so much for joining me today. And feel free to reach out, like if you, oh, thank you. And I'm gonna put my website here. Oh, yep. I'm like, do I know my website? I'm gonna put my website in the chat for anybody. So if you wanna, where that's, I just realized, so, yeah, there you go. So if you are interested in more writing by me or music, which it's funny when I do, someday when we can do these live, I would love to incorporate a little music into these presentations, but I found it really, Zoom is not conducive for doing that kind of performance. So I also play music. If you are interested in that, you can check out my website, and my email address is on there too. If you would like to reach out and have any other questions. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Eliza. And thank you everyone else for coming. Thank you. Okay, I guess that's it. If anybody has any other comments or questions, got a lot of thank yous here. But I'm gonna say that's it. Thank you so much for your time, Eliza. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.